Here's my 2002 DR-Z400S that I've had since 2006. So the topic of today's video is going to be this starter button. So up through the 2005 model year, the DR-Z used the same style starter button and switch pod as the DR-350. On my DR-350, I used to have to take this switch pod apart and mess with the starter button. So that's what we're going to do today on my DR-Z, because it has started to develop the same issue that my DR-350 had developed. And this is something that I usually have to do about every 3 or 4 years. If you get to the point where pressing the starter button doesn't necessarily engage the starter, but if you kind of wiggle the button back and forth in a rotational fashion or side to side, and then it does engage, then you'll know exactly what the issue is that we're going to describe. So what happens is, on the back side of this button and on a circuit board inside of the switch pod, there's 2 contacts. What happens is those contacts get carboned up and then they don't make a good electrical connection. So we're going to take that whole switch pod apart, take a look inside of that, and get those contacts cleaned up, and then we should be back in business with easy engagement of the starter when we just simply push the button like that. So I've already taken the switch pod apart, and we're going to zoom in here and look at it closer. So there's a screw that I've already removed that holds that circuit board in place, and then you could see a little chunk of blue towel jammed in behind the circuit board. I'll describe a little bit about the purpose of that later in this video. But here's looking at the button. You can see how the contacts are all carboned up pretty bad. So I just take a pencil eraser and clean those up and get them all nice and shiny. And then I do the same thing to the little contact on the circuit board. When you take the circuit board and switch out, be sure not to lose the little spring. Reinstalling the button and getting the spring positioned is kind of a chore, because the spring keeps wanting to fall out and move. You can see here that I struggle with it for a while. Eventually I pull the button out, set the spring on top of the button, and then drop the button into place. And then I just have to remember to carefully hold the switch pod so that that spring doesn't fall out and lose position. The very first time I had this issue on my DR-350 back in about 1997 or so, I just kept mashing the starter button harder and harder trying to get the bike to start, and what I ended up doing is breaking that little circuit board right where I drew that little line. So what happens is that circuit board can break if you put excessive pressure on the starter button. On the side of the circuit board there's a little tab, and that tab needs to go into that little notch on the side of the switch pod. I struggled with that circuit board for a few minutes trying to get it oriented and keeping the spring in position, and then I had also forgotten about that little tab which I showed earlier. So once I got all that figured out, then I got that grommet situated in place, and then we're getting ready to install the little metal clip and the screw that hold that circuit board into the switch pod housing. After I get the screw and the little bracket reinstalled, then I take up some sort of a little sharp object like a pencil or a pen, and then jam a bunch of paper towel underneath that rubber grommet, because that's right where the pressure point is on the starter button. And basically putting that little piece of blue towel in there prevents that circuit board from flexing if excessive pressure is used on the starter button. For the 2006 and later model year DR-Z, Suzuki redesigned that switch pod and the entire starter button assembly, and they probably did that specifically to eliminate this problem. Several years ago I actually looked at upgrading my old DR-Z to the new style switch pod, but it doesn't look like they're interchangeable, because from what I could tell, the new switch pod uses a different wiring connector that interfaces with the wiring harness for the actual motorcycle.